Greetings, friends! Rodynske here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine update for the week of October 20th through October 26th of 2025. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, share this video around. Keep being amazing, and we're going to go into, first of all, the Pokrovsk direction, the main thing of this entire, kind of the most biggest thing of the year. This is where all the action really is happening. And this week we have good news, well, depending on who you ask, for the Russians and the Ukrainians, depending on the section. Now, in Pokrovsk itself, this is where good news is for the Russians. We talked about how the Russians broke through into Pokrovsk and have captured almost the entire southern part of Pokrovsk, and not only that, they have crossed the rail line, and we have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in these warehouses in the northwestern part of Pokrovsk, which I mentioned earlier, cuts off most of the main logistics to Pokrovsk and Leningrad. We have geolocated confirmation of the Russians crossing the railroad from this angle and being in these buildings on the other side of the rail line. We got more and more geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this area, which confirms that pretty much it's certain that these high-rise buildings are under Russian control. We had more geolocated confirmation of the Russians being all over the southern part of Pokrovsk, which gives us more and more confirmation that Russians are in the southern part. And we talked about that last week. We just got more confirmation that the southern part underneath this rail line is under Russian control. So right now the battle is going on basically for two areas that are very important. The Pokrovsk rail line and these warehouses. Now, as I mentioned last week, is that, go see last week's video where I described about how when we use mappers to talk about what's going on the ground in the war in Ukraine, it's not as simple as like, oh, the red spot is 100% Russian control and the blue side 100% Ukrainian control. It's a lot more of a fluid, liquidy state. So, just because, like, for example, it's not like, right now we could generally say that underneath the rail line of this is that underneath it is mostly Russian. It's mostly Russian control. Underneath it, on the north is mostly Ukrainian control. That being said, the Ukrainians could still have units hiding, and they can still infiltrate into the southern part here. It doesn't mean it's 100% Russian control. Vice versa. On the northern part, there is Russian DRGs operating in the northern part as well. So it's not like 100% one way or the other. It's that it's the further back you go, it's more and more like 100% solidified. But right now it's just that it's less of a once you color something, it's more like, think of it as it's mostly under that control. So we could say, for example, that the Russians might be mostly under controlling the rail line, but maybe that's more of like a 50-50. There are still a ton of Ukrainians in this area. Same thing for these warehouses. So this is where, and what the Russians want to do is start moving northwards. They want to push into the northern residential areas of Pokrovsk. They want to push towards these kind of these northwestern residential areas here, so that as they push the Ukrainians towards Grishny, push the Ukrainians out to the northern outskirts of Pokrovsk, so that they could actually have the rail line and these warehouses be more under 100% Russian control. Or maybe even 90 or 80%, rather than say maybe it's a 50-50 split at the moment. But right now, these are where the clashes are happening. I have no doubt that probably as the Russians push, that these two villages of Ivanivka and Riva, up around this point, will probably be captured by the end of next week. It just makes sense, I don't see the Ukrainians trying to hold on here, especially as the Russians are already right here and they're on the south here. So I don't see the Ukrainians. They're probably going to try to retreat to this rail line just to create a more stable front line, with their units trying to retreat to the center of Leningrad and the northern part of Pokrovsk here. So lots of things happening there, and that is, and right now the Russians are just solidifying themselves in the southern part, clearing out Ukrainian control. And this week, basically, the biggest changes is that we have more confirmation that the Russians are there, and they have more and more control. So maybe before it was 60-40, the Russians in the southern part. Now maybe it's 80-20 of how many Russian troops are in the southern part versus Ukrainians. And the Russians are now bleeding into the northern part. Whereas before, maybe there was barely any Russian troops in the northern part. Maybe now, maybe 10-20% of this area is made up of Russian DRGs, and the rest are Ukrainian. So now, as you can see, it's just slowly moving. It's like a expanding pool of water, rather than like a solid cake, if that makes sense. In Minigrad, the Russians are also making a lot of progress, and I have right now it seems like the Russians are pushing into the southern Minigrad quarter, this area right here. And this week, we had 100%. Well, we had GLK confirmation of the Russians getting bombed in this Minigrad mine here. I think it's called the number 5 mine or something. This area right here, and this is a really good gain for the Russians. This is a very strong stronghold in the southern part. It's the main stronghold in the southern part of Minigrad, and the Russians being there shows that the Russians could accumulate forces in this area, have a local height advantage here, and then from here, I have what I'm betting is the Russians will continue bursting through this area, just as the Russians are bursting towards this area. And probably the main goal for the Russians is to take something like this, solidify everything underneath this line. And I have no doubts that the Ukrainians will probably, and this is probably why the Ukrainians aren't fighting so hard for this area, is because they are right now trying to organize a more solid defense on this kind of a northern part of Pokrovsk and in the center part of Minigrad in this area. Because, as you can see, this is a very, if you kind of scroll out of it, is that this is a very deep pocket. And, the Ukrainians having to supply their garrisons here, even in here, it's hard enough to even just supply troops in the main areas here already. The Ukrainians are saying that it's such a pain in the ass to do so, but imagine having to then also go even deeper into this pocket. So the Ukrainians are doing a pullback here, and I have no doubts that the Russians will probably try to take something like this. And then, the Ukrainians will then just have to support their garrison here. But as you can see, even if they retreat behind this red line and give up the southern part of Minigrad Pokrovsk, this is still in a pocket. And especially this is true because of the capture of Rodynske. Now, we had more and more confirmation of the Russians being in Rodynske this week. We had them in the southern part of this one. We had them raising their flag, I think somewhere, a lot of this in the southern part here. We also, a lot of people are saying that the northern part was taken, which makes sense because the Ukrainians didn't want to defend this because it's just a bunch of residential areas. The main center of Ukrainian resistance was in the center, the southwestern center, or the center west center. Fuck it. This area right here has a bunch of high-rise buildings in the center part of Rodynske, and this was where the axis was the main center of Ukrainian resistance. Now, most Russian sources are saying that the town of the city of Rodynske has fallen and has been captured by the Russians. This is a very big gain for the Russians because this was what was holding, as I mentioned, that Rodynske had to be captured in order to actually complete the operational encirclement of Pokrovsk and Minigrad, and they seem to have taken it. Now, a lot of more pro-Ukrainian sources are saying that no, that's not the case, that it's like more fluid, is that, yes, the Russians are all over Rodynske, but there's still Ukrainian resistance there. It's not a solid control, which actually I could buy. That is definitely could be the case where maybe the Russians say they are operating all over here, but they're not cleared it yet. There's probably a bunch of Ukrainians in the basements in these high-rise buildings that they can't solidify themselves fully here. But that being said, just because maybe the Russians aren't totally holding here does not negate the fact that it's going to be very hard for the Ukrainians to now supply the garrisons here. The main kind of so-called road of life is through Grishny and through this road here and then down here. However, a lot of Russian sources are now saying the Russians are pushing from their sources Rodynske and Cherkassky Lyman, trying to capture a bunch of these fields here and a bunch of these warehouses to the north of Minigrad and just slowly encircle the Ukrainians. In fact, Gerasimov was saying that they actually had a physical encirclement of the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk and Minigrad. A lot of sources are saying that the Russians somehow met up and did a physical encirclement. I think that's baloney. I think if we want to be charitable, is that maybe Russian operatives are advancing so far deep that from the north here, pushing to the south, and from the north here, that maybe they're able to clap hands here, but it's not some sort of physical encirclement. It's not like there's like a huge Russian contingent holding off any the guys here. If you want to be very generous, is that maybe they're they're able to sink all, they're able to send units to infiltrate, and they're able to go all along this area. There's no area they can't touch, but that doesn't mean that they're able to solidify themselves there or consolidate. It's just that maybe they're able to infiltrate, which is pretty bad because, if maybe you have a Russian DRG unit here, and then, you think this has no unit, and then they ambush you by accident, or not by accident, but, you don't expect that. They're just causing chaos in the supply rear. So, I mean, it's still bad news, but it's not like a physical encirclement in the traditional sense that you would think, if you want to be charitable. Also, a bit more to the west, is good news for the Russians, is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Molodetska, just, taking another area along this rail line. And also we had GLK confirmation of the Russians being in this very strong stronghold that's on the Donetsk-Dnipropetrovsk border, which also helps solidify their western flank here. If you scroll down, you can see this. It looks like a dress or some shit. You can see it here. This is a very strong stronghold on the Donetsk-Dnipropetrovsk border, and we had a GLK confirmation of the Russians being here. I don't know if they solidified it, but we did know the Russians assaulted and tried to take it. I think they said they took it, but this map obviously has not updated to show that, but maybe they got kicked out. We just need to wait. So, that being said, so very good news for the West, just securing their line along the Donetsk-Dnipropetrovsk border, which helps the Russians in their flank. However, where the Ukrainians are having good news is in this Dnipropetrovsk salient. This is the area where, this is kind of the quintessential area where you could talk about everything is very much in motion, it's very much more liquid, and that way each side could claim that actually no, we're here. But again, this is where but this week we showed that the Ukrainians did do a bunch of counterattacks and did raise their flags. The biggest one is that the Ukrainians cut off. In the northern part of Kuchuk Yar, we saw them taking a bunch of Russian prisoners and raising their flag here. So the Ukraine said that proves that they completely captured Kuchuk Yar. That probably is true. Maybe they did capture Kuchuk Yar. The Russian sources are saying that no, they came here, but the Russians are still able to enter Kuchuk Yar. They entered here, they took some prisoners, and then retreated. And Kuchuk Yar is more of like a gray zone instead of the Ukrainians now solidifying themselves here. That is what the Russians are saying. Either way, regardless if it's more of whoever is right, Kuchuk Yar is no longer a solid point of resistance for the Russians. Either it's under Ukraine control or it's more of like a fluid gray zone. Again, though, a lot of this area is very much gray zone. Like, you could still have Russian troops like DRGs operating very much even closer to Zolotaya Kolodovsky, but it's not very consolidated, and vice versa. You could have the Ukrainians breaking through here. So it's just how much of it is just fluid DRG activity, how much of it is actually consolidation. It's very hard to tell in this Dnipropetrovsk salient, but we could say we could move it a little bit where Ukrainian positions are, this is less of a solid of where the Russians are mostly in control. Maybe it's more under Ukrainian control now, but the Russians probably do have the ability to still infiltrate Kuchuk Yar and make it hell for the Ukrainians trying to consolidate here. So, but it does show Kuchuk Yar is no longer under Russian control fully, or at least not as much. But, maybe we're wrong. Maybe it was just a flag opera. We'll see. Another thing where the Ukrainians are now making a lot of progress is this area. We had a GLK confirmation of the Ukrainians being in this Novoshakovo area. They also took. I don't think they raised their flags, but I think there was some GLK confirmation of the Ukrainians taking prisoners near Novoshakovo, showing that this area near Vilna is also more fluid and less of under Russian control. But again, again, if you talk to pro-Russian sources, they're like, well, yes, the Ukrainians could infiltrate these areas, but the Russians could also infiltrate. It's not very... This entire area, if you could kind of look at it from the up, kind of like this entire area here, is very much a very fluid area. And, everyone enters, and it's like a giant orgy, and no one knows what the fuck is going on. So, it's very, you're able to, and it's what the Ukrainians are trying to do, because the Ukrainians have been mostly on the counterattack here. We talked about how the Russians secured their flanks, but it seems like they've been on a mission after it seems like the Pokrovsk area collapsed, is that they're trying to do some sort of PR victory, sending in their big, very capable forces like Azov, the 82nd Airborne Battalion, I believe, or brigade, to, very capable units to try to retake this area. So, they're trying to, squeeze the loss of Pokrovsk, which will happen within like a month or so, probably in November sometime, with like, oh, we also destroyed this Dnipropetrovsk salient, just to try to, soften the PR blow. Along with this, we had, I think the Ukrainians said they were in Shecheshuski here, this village right here. Again, and also they said they're in Zaporizhia. However, we had GLK confirmation of the Russians being here. So we showed that the Russians are here, but we also had, I think there was a video, the Ukrainians claiming they were here. I don't know if that was geolocated, but the Ukrainians were saying it was here. So it does show that this area is very much, again, very fluid. I would say probably like Again, like as you fall back, like when you go towards this mine in Belitsky, it's more under full Ukrainian control, and then when you get to this rail line, it's very fluid. But then when you get back here towards these like trenches that are around this area in Novotoretska, maybe it's more under solid Russian control, along with this kind of Rodynske mine. So it's very fluid in this area. But again, it shows that the Ukrainians are on the move. Also, but in terms of good news for the Russians, but again, this could just be the fluid nature of this area, is that the Russians have entered the village of Shakova, which is a very strong stronghold on the western part of the salient, and we actually had the Russians entering Shakova. Now, we don't know if they got kicked out. We don't know if they solidified. But the Russians have been bombing Shakova very hard, very strongly, and they are very much trying to hold on to Shakova. And if they can take Shakova, that really secures their western flank or eastern flank very well. Sorry, I got my directions confused. But again, so it looks like the western flank is now, or eastern flank is being more secured by the Russians, with them trying to storm Shakova and take it. But the Ukrainians on the western flank is being now activated and making it more weaker. So, if the Russians could at least hold on to their positions around this area and just prevent the Ukrainians from getting deeper into the salient, then that would really help in their salient here. If they could at least just hold on to something like this going on, then that makes it less of a salient and more of a solidified front line, and there's less of their flanks are less exposed. I've always this area towards Zolotaya-Kolodovsky was just a very giant salient. So this might save Tereska and Sofivka from being taken, but the Russians could still have this northern area secured around this area and such, and that would make it a bit more easier to defend. So maybe that might save Dnipropetrovsk a bit, but it doesn't. This would help the Russians at least secure their northern flank in Pokrovsk. Alrighty. Also, because of this, I forgot to mention that these villages of Balaton, Kolodovsky, and Promnen have also been fully secured. But I talked about that last week. But now that the Russians are battling in this southern part of Leningrad, this confirms that these 3 villages were taken. Alrighty. Alright, now we're going to go to the Dnipropetrovsk direction, even though this kind of is basically in... a lot of it is in Zaporizhia, but I kind of combined everything from this area near Ivanivka all the way down to Gulyapolia, this entire kind of area here. Yeah, we shall see how that develops. So first, the biggest thing of this week is that the Russians have completely captured the town of Ivanivka, creating a very solid bridgehead on the other side of the Volchka River, which very much threatens the Ukrainian garrison in Novopalovka. We had GLK confirmation of the Russians raising their flags in the center part of Ivanivka, which proves that Ivanivka has been taken. Obviously, you can say, well, they didn't raise any flags on the western side, but I think them raising the flags in the center part does prove that the Russians are in control of Ivanivka. Also, along with this, a lot of mappers are saying that these kind of fields to the north of it have been captured, which makes sense. Along with this, a lot of sources are saying they're kind of trying to combine their kind of force around Filia, trying to capture these kind of forests here and this area right here, and that they're solidifying themselves here, and which makes sense. We also talked about last week how the Russians captured are clearing these fields to the south of Novopalovka. So as you can see, with the capture of Ivanivka and the capture of these fields here, is that the Russians are making very strong progress in creating a bridgehead on the other side of the Volchka River, which they can use to start encircling Novopalovka. So, which is a very good gain for the Russians. But yeah, the capture of Ivanivka, very big gain for the Russians in this direction. And then if we look down towards the Uspenivka area, again, the Russians are slowly but surely trying to put the squeeze on this Uspenivka fortified area. We talked about how this is one of the biggest defenses because it's on the other side of the river. Uspenivka is pretty big. The Russians have to push through a bunch of fields, which is very bad for drone if you're under attack by drones. So what the Russians are doing, they're squeezing it from the south, and right now they're squeezing it from the north because this week in the north, the biggest gains is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Zala Gadoda. This village, which is actually on the other side of the Yanchar River, which is a very good gain for the Russians. Some Russian sources are saying they're now storming the villages of Krasnogorsky and Rubinia, which makes sense. I have no doubt that these 2 small villages will be taken by the Russians. soon. We also had GLK confirmation of the Russians walking around on this street right here in the village of Zaporizhia. Now we haven't confirmed that this village has been taken, but if the Russians are walking calmly on this street right here, and so I have no doubts that probably the Russians probably have not secured themselves here, but they probably are operating very much in this area right here. And probably the goal here is to try to encircle the village of Vyshinia, which is a very big town for the Russians. The Russians have been bombing this town very heavily, and this is the linchpin for. This is a very good game. If the Russians could storm this Vyshinia and take the town, this would give them a forward operating base to then cut off the Pokrovsk-Gallipoli road, which is the main operation in this push towards Gallipoli. And also they're able to accumulate forces instead of, because right now there's just a bunch of small villages, and Vyshinia is one of the biggest towns. If they could take it, where they could accumulate forces more deeper in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast here. So right now I think capturing after they captured Privya last week and them entering Kupyansk and Ivanivka this week, right now it looks like they're trying to do some sort of encirclement maneuver in Vyshinia. Along with this, the Russians have also completely captured Pavlovka, and I think right now probably one of the biggest games right now is the Russians are bombing Pervilia, but this is a bit more bigger. This has a bunch of warehouses, but again, it's on the other side of Yancha River, so it's very hard for the Ukrainians to supply the garrison here. So, but it is a bit more defendable than these kind of small villages of little hamlets and huts. But I do think the Russians will take this, and the main goal for the Russians right now is probably to take something like this. That way they could enter Ivanivka from the north, and right now they're probably going to be, they took Poltavka and Novomykolaievka last week, so I have no doubts that the Russians will probably try to enter Ivanivka from the south here, and then squeeze it on multiple angles from the south, from the north, from the east, and then, take it. And then with the Ivanivka taken, this will be the forward operating base for the Russians, and then they could use this as the accumulation center. And I think right now, for the next probably few weeks, is that the main goal for the Russians is to try to take the Vyshinia-Ivanivka defense line here. And then once they take that, this will break the one the forward operating base for the or it would break the last line of defense towards Gallipoli, and then this would allow them to accumulate forces to then do their next big push towards this highway, and try to probably cut off Gallipoli. They probably will try to storm Gallipoli, but it also gives them options to push towards this river right here, the Vochka River, towards Pokrovsk and Velika Milikaevka. Because right now the Ukrainians are using these Pokrovsk and Velika Milikaevka to do counterattacks. For example, now the thing is that I'm not like following because I don't know where all the sources are at. So I have a bunch of sources I follow, but I don't have unlimited sources. So sometimes I'm cut off. So for example, Syriac says, "Oh, I saw something that said the Ukrainians are in Alexandrihard," but I didn't see that. I have not seen. And it's not that I just follow just pro-Russian sources. I follow pro-Ukrainian sources. I follow neutral sources, pro-Russian sources. I follow all the sources I can, but I don't follow everything. And sometimes I might miss something that maybe my sources don't pick up. So I haven't seen anything about Alexandrihard being taken by the Ukrainians. I haven't not seen any flag raising operations. I did see a GLK confirmation of the Russians being near Novoselivka, for example. And such. So it's like, the Russians are here, I have doubts why the Ukrainians would be here. We have the Russians being in Andriivka, Klitzelovo. It's going to be very hard for the Ukrainians to supply their garrison here. Maybe it's more of a gray zone. Maybe they did some sort of flag raising operation and then left just to, for PR purposes. I don't know. Because, again, I will say that it is hard to supply the Russian troops that are here because it's just a bunch of small villages, and, to supply them it's very hard. The Ukrainians have Velika Milikaevka, but again, I haven't actually seen that video of the Ukrainians being in Alexandrihard. So these kind of villages in the northern part of the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast the Russians are at are where the Ukrainians are doing the counterattacks. But again, I think once the Russians reach the Vyshinia-Ivanivka line and cut off, and then push and cut off Gallipoli, I think one of the next things the Russians will try to do is probably try to push up against Pokrovsk and Velika Milikaevka and Alexandriivka and Aristepopol, just to hold the line there, and probably try to capture these two big towns, which will give them a foothold in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. Anyway, that's that direction. The next, we're going to talk about the Zaporizhia and Kherson directions. And this week, when the Russians did a massive attack towards Orekov, just did a massive attack from Robotina towards Orekov, we actually had geolocated confirmation of the Russians zooming across Malaktakmashka and getting into the center part of this village. We had some geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in these fields to the south of Novodolivka. So, how much of the Russians consolidate, we don't know. We just saw there was a massive attack. The Ukrainians say they destroyed a bunch. But we don't know the exact extent. We don't know if the Russians were able to consolidate. We don't know how much they pushed in, how much they were pushed out. Maybe they consolidated only a little bit. That being said, it is definitely very interesting in terms of. So we just know there was a massive attack happening near Orekov, and we just don't know the information of where they are yet. So the biggest thing with the Russians, if the Russians want to have anything from this massive attack, is that they should have tried to capture this former prison in Malaktakmashka, this area right here. As you can see, it's a very big prison, very big, because the rest of Malaktakmashka is just a bunch of residential areas. If the Russians could have taken even just half the village, we saw the Russians breaking into very deep into the village, but they don't have to take a bunch of it. What they should do, if they could at least capture something like this and have this prison under their control, this would give them a very strong forward operating base in Malaktakmashka, which will be very hard for the Ukrainians to knock them out like they did before. So if they could capture this prison, they'd be in very good shape in Malaktakmashka. As far as the attack source Novodolivka or towards Ivanivka, maybe this gives them more forward operating bases to accumulate forces, but again, these are just a bunch of tree lines. There's no solidified areas, so it's gonna be very hard for the Russians to move through these areas in the open fields under the cover of Ukrainian drones. So, yeah, it's gonna. I think that we shall see how that. We just need to wait more to see what happened here. In the more western part, there's actually not been that much changes. The battle for the southern part of Stephanhersk is still ongoing. The battle for the southern part of Primorska in this residential area is still ongoing, but there's been no map changes so far. And then in the Kherson direction, there's actually been some more movements happening in Kherson, a lot more than before. There's been nothing. Now, a lot of the sources are showing that the Russians have captured what they call the Quarantine Island. This is Quarantine Island right here. As you can see, I don't think that there's much actually here. There's probably a few buildings, but again, these are just part of the Russian probably push to try to capture a bunch of these islands on the Dnieper River, which a lot of source mappers are saying that over the course of this year, the Russians have slowly but surely captured a bunch of these islands on the Dnieper River, so capture the Quarantine Islands just another step in that, but I don't think they're going to try to push towards Kherson. To be honest, I think I truly think that that they're just trying to make sure that their positions on the Dnieper River are just more secure, and having these forward operating bases prevents another Ukrainian counterattack across the Dnieper River. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Kostyantynivka direction, and this week we actually had a very not a lot of changes, but a very important change happened in the Kostyantynivka direction. The biggest thing that happened is that we actually had geolocate confirmation of the Russians operating deep within this area right here, and a lot of pro-Russian sources are now saying that everything below the T0504 road and north of the rail line, this area right here of the part of Kostyantynivka is now more of a gray zone. They're not saying that's under Russian control, obviously. They're just saying that now Russians are able to operate here, and it's less of a full, maybe it's more of a 50, the Russians are now being able to penetrate here, which makes sense. The thing is that, if the Russians, are in here, and let's say they are able to consolidate in this kind of residential area of Kostyantynivka, it's just, as you can see, it's just very hard to support their positions here. This is why I think the Russians are pushing through here, because if they could capture a bunch of these suburbs to the south of Kostyantynivka, they could then use these as kind of village hopping, where they could accumulate forces here and then if they capture Ivanivka and Pleshivka, they could then use these to to push toward to put troops back into Kostyantynivka is a lot easier. Whereas right now, it's just a bunch of fields here, and it's very hard. All these villages are basically destroyed and reduced to rubble, so it's very hard to accumulate forces here and then enter Kostyantynivka. And the Ukrainians have this entire city to push the Russians out. So it's very. But we did show that the Russians have operated deep into this southern residential area right here. So. We shall see if they consolidate. I think it's going to be very hard for them to do so, but we shall see if they're able to do so. So, but that is the important part, is that they are actually in Kostyantynivka operating in that area. The other thing is that we actually had GLK confirmation the Russians having finally taken this stronghold to the north of Kupyansk. Most mappers are now saying that the village Pleshishkia is now being fully captured. We don't have the Russian Ministry of Defense said they captured it, but we don't have any we didn't have like the Russians raising their flags here to confirm it yet. So it's just a matter of kind of just figuring that out at the moment. But most mappers are now saying Pleshivka is being fought over, so we shall see how that develops. And then a bit more to the north here is that a lot of these trenches that are north of Yablunivka and Alexandria, and what is this? I forgot. Alexandria Kelenovo are being taken by the Russians. These trenches right here, which makes sense. These are very strong strongholds, and I think the Ukrainians are just they didn't want to keep putting forces here. Again, taking these strongholds gives the Russians another area to accumulate forces, but again, I think the Ukrainians want to retreat back to Kostyantynivka and defend their positions here, and prevent the Russians from, so the Russians are probably just trying to, hold their positions around Yablunivka and Kelban-Balka, and then kind of push more towards from the more eastern side of Kostyantynivka. But that is it. In the Seversk direction, there's been some small changes as well. But again, a very interesting change. The biggest one is that we have a GLK confirmation of the Russians being in Dornivka, which is one of the biggest, which was the key to the northern part of Seversk. And so we actually had GLK confirmation of the Russians being in this northern part of Dornivka. They said that this entire village has been captured, which I have no doubt that probably is true. This is especially probably true because the Russians are pushing right into Yampil. We don't know if the Russians have completely captured it yet, but we'll talk about that when we talk about the Lyman front in a bit. But taking Dornivka is just another step of them continuously putting the pressure on Seversk. The Russians are also putting pressure on Seversk on the south. We have the Russians capturing more and more of these tree lines to the east of Vinivka. A lot of sources are saying the Russians are trying to accumulate to start trying to storm the village of Zanivka right here. And again, the main goal is probably to take Zanivka, take this area, probably try to take this area right here. The thing is that the main defense of the southern part of Seversk is Svatovo-Pokrovsky and this giant fortification complex right here. And again, it's on the other side of the river. It's on high ground. It's going to be very hard for the Russians to attack it here. So I think at this point, what I would do is that if I was the Russians, to take these positions like right here, and then from here, you're able to basically put the squeeze on Seversk. I think at this point, I would just start storming Seversk and try to enter it. Because at this point, you have basically Seversk surrounded on most angles. You could still escape Seversk, but it's under tight control of drones. And I think at this point, I wouldn't, I would just wait until, I wouldn't try to storm uphill towards fortified areas, because I think it would be better just to try to start entering Seversk and start using its buildings as cover. Anyway, that is the Seversk direction. Just the Russians, taking Dornivka is very good for the Russians. And I think once they take Ivanivka, I think once those two villages are secure, the Russians will be in a very good place to start storming Seversk. So the battle for Seversk is probably about to start officially. We're now going to go to the Lyman direction, and same thing in Lyman. Again, a lot of things are happening where the Russians are slowly putting the tools together to encircle Lyman. The biggest thing is that we had most mappers, or even the pro-Ukrainian maps, are saying that this forest area around the north of Yampil has been completely captured by the Russians, and even actually we had Russian operatives entering the most southern part of Lyman in this area right here. So very big. The thing is before is that forests were very bad for the Russians. The Russians really didn't know what to do with forests. But I think with forests is that they provide excellent coverage for against drones. So I think what the Russians do is they use these forests as like natural cover to push through. So maybe before, the Russians were really bad at fighting in forest, but now maybe fighting in forest might be the kryptonite to the Ukrainians, or if I'm using that term correctly. Because, they took the Seversk forest very strong. This was a fortified area. It was frozen for like 2-3 years, and then they took it very fast during the summer campaign. And so this forest to the south of Lyman, maybe this is what the Russians need to have cover, and this would allow them to infiltrate. This allows them to infiltrate very well. Because of this, the Ukrainians are really trying to hold on to Yampil. We know that the northern part has been taken. We know the battles are going for the center part of Yampil. But I think with the capture of these forests, or at least the Russians very much breaking into this and being very operative here, I do think Yampil will fall, and then the highway between Seversk and Lyman will be cut. The Russians will take Zaporizhia and Orzarnia, and then they'll have the Seversky Donetsk River to protect themselves on the southern flank here, and then they'll focus again. The Seversky Donetsk River goes like this. As you can see, they're protected from the south, but also mostly from the west, and basically then they can then focus their efforts on the southern part of Lyman. So with their flanks being secured by the river, this is why pushing into this forest here is very bad for the Ukrainians here, and also cuts off more logistics to the Seversk direction here. Along with this, the Russians are also pushing, tightening the encirclement in the northern part. We had a lot of sources are saying the Russians are now capturing a bunch of these tree lines to the west of Zaporizhia, which makes sense. And also that the battle for Stavki is now ongoing. Stavki is on the high ground here. It's on the more higher elevation here. It also is a very, kind of like the last stronghold, human-made stronghold before Lyman. So a lot of sources are saying the Russians entered the northern part of Stavki, and the battle for it is still ongoing. But we shall see how. But the Stavki is still being fought over. So we shall see if the Russians take it. But I have no doubts that the Russians will probably take Stavki and then push here. But I don't think the Russians are going to enter Lyman directly because there's a bunch of trenches here. And I think the main thing is that Russians are just going to continuously. The main goal here is to push the Ukrainians to Lyman, take this entire forest area to the south of Lyman, and then, as we can see in the northern part here, the last thing they need to take is the town of Dnipropetrovsk, which they already are in the northern part. They took Novoselivka, and right now a lot of sources are saying that the Russians are infiltrating the village of Yarnova, and because of this, because with the fall of Novoselivka, which most people are saying confirmed. We actually don't have any people raising their flags. Maybe it's like they kicked the Ukrainians out of it, but it's very hard to accumulate forces here for the Russians. So maybe it's not as secure for the Russians as we think. But in any case, there's no Ukrainian presence here, according to most mappers. But a lot of people are saying that this road that connects the northern part of Lyman has been cut. Now, the Russians have to accumulate forces here, so that way, if they could take this forest area near they don't have to take all of Yarnava, especially this most western part of it. But if they could take, Novoselivka, Dorbeshi, this area right here, then they could then break into the northern part of Lyman. And as you can see, if they could they're right now doing all these steps to, if they could take something like this, and then, take something like this in the south of Lyman. So at this point, it'll be something like that. And at that point, as you can see, then, the Ukrainians are in very much big trouble in Lyman. They'll be able to then encircle this town, and the battle at Lyman will fall pretty quickly once that happens. Because then you might think, well, then the southern part might save them. The thing is that there's the Seversky Donetsk River right here, and as you can see, this very much complicates the logistics for the Ukrainians here. So if the Russians cut off the roads here, then they have to supply them from their across the river here, but the Russians can destroy all these pontoon crossings, so the supply of Lyman will be very much in trouble. But yeah, there's that, and now we're going to go to the Kupyansk direction in the north here, and in the Kupyansk direction, there's been some very interesting changes. The biggest thing is that the battle for southern Kupyansk is still ongoing. So again, the same thing is in Pokrovsk. The thing is that there might be still Ukrainian resistance in the center part of Kupyansk, but it does not mean that there's not, but it might be under mostly Russian control. It does not mean it's 100% under Russian control. But where there's more of like a 50-50 split, where maybe there's Russian operatives operating, but there's Ukrainians are still fiercely fighting, is the southern part. As you can see, there's like a citadel here in the southern part of Kupyansk that is being fought over. And so right now, the entire western break is not completely captured as of yet, but that is where it's being fought over. And the Ukrainians are making a bunch of counterattacks in the north here. We had the Ukrainians do a counterattack that actually reached them right here, and then they got completely blown up and destroyed. But that does show that, I talked about this before. I thought, them attacking Kupyansk was a fool's errand, because I thought, like, hey, you have to secure yourselves in the northern part of Kupyansk before you break into it. And they just took a few of these villages, like Kondrashevka and such, and then they got into Kupyansk. I'm like, hey, the Ukrainians are going to counterattack you. But the thing is, they never really did that. They waited until the Kupyansk almost fell. And now they're doing a bunch of these counterattacks, which they're being repelled at the moment. But again, one good place counterattack can cut off the logistics of the Russian grouping that's in this part of Kupyansk. So it's the logistics here is very precarious for the Russians. So I think that, but again, the Russians are about to clean up Kupyansk. and so forth. But again, the logistics here in the north are more tenuous than I would be comfortable with if I was a Russian commander here. But again, they're so far holding, and they're about to clean up the western part of Kupyansk. Now, there's been a lot of we had a very interesting video about the Russians raising their flags. I forgot where, but someplace in the village of Krylovstovka here. I think it was like somewhere in this area right here. We had the Russians raising their flags in Pashada. And there's been some sources that are saying that the Ukrainians are planning a withdrawal on the this is on the other side of the Osko River. So the logistics here are ass. And Kupyansk was the main center of like resistance here. But with the fall of Kupyansk happening now, the ability to supply the Ukrainian garrison on the other side of the Osko River is going to be very much in jeopardy. And this is why the Russians are probably able to reach Pashana, because they're probably slowly but surely withdrawing from their positions here and trying to just find a way to cross the river and try to formulate a defense on the other side of the Osko River. So, but again, we shall see how that's just rumors for now, but we shall see. So, but if that is the case, the Ukrainians are slowly withdrawing from this area. That probably does show how the Russians were able to break through and raise their flags in Krylovstovka. But again, this probably isn't Russian consolidation. I think it's what they're waiting for. Again, I mentioned this last week, is for the Russians to take Kupyansk and then just slowly but surely be able to attack on multiple angles. So maybe then they could take Petropavlovka, the eastern side of Kupyansk, and then from here they could then continue pushing southwards and put pressure on Kupyansk, Vyzhysholi, and so forth. So I think the main goal for the Russians is to take Kupyansk and liquidate this salient on the other side of the Osko River here. A bit more in the northern part, in the Kharkov area as well. I kind of combined the Kupyansk-Kharkov directions. Is that the Russians are also continuously making progress here. The Russians have crossed the border again and captured the village of Bologivka, another border town. And a lot of pro-Russian sources are saying that this area between Bologivki and then Strodovka, this area has combined. So basically, these two kind of separate fronts, the Moldova front and then the Dorishnya bridgehead, have combined. Now, I don't think that means there's like Russian troops like literally guarding like maybe these like forests here between Bologivka and Storivka, but I don't think there's Ukrainians here. And honestly, I don't think there's pretty much a lot of Ukrainians in this area. It's probably like some little dugouts, like maybe a couple, like 1 or 2 dozen Ukrainians in this entire area, which is very big. But where the main Ukrainian defenses are on these line of villages along the river here, they have and such. So I do think this area, I think what the Russians will probably try to do is take the village of Dorashki here, combine the Moldova front with the Dorishnya front. This does help protect at least this part of the Belgorod area. But yeah, so because the main Ukrainian resistance is along this area, and we shall see how that. And I think right now with the catch of Bologivka and the Russians finally clearing, connecting these two, I think the Russians will take this last village and combined, just kind of liquidate this entire salient here, or at least kick the Ukrainians out of here and force them to retreat back here. But yeah, so just taking more and more of this area. So pretty good game for the Russians. And then also in the Volchansk area, the Russians are continuously battling for this town. The battle for this town is coming to the end. The Russians actually now have captured the western part. And we know this because now the next village, the village of Shitikilovo here, we actually have the Russians being bombed in the most northern streets of this village here. So it does show that the Russians are actually, they're able to start battling for this village. So it does show that the western part of Volchansk is under their control. The main thing is that the Ukrainians have this strong southern citadel here, and so if the Russians could crack this egg here, then they'll basically take the rest of Volchansk, and once Volchansk falls, then it'll be it's gonna be the Russians gonna use it as a foothold. The thing is, Volchansk was completely blown to ruins. It's very much it's like completely destroyed. The southern part's a bit more intact, but maybe they might destroy that entirely to try to take it. So Volchansk is really very destroyed. So we shall see how that develops. But the how do you say it? The I had a brain fart just now. Anyway, but yeah, it does show that the Russians will probably try to take a bunch of these villages to the south here, which helps their western flank near Staritsia here, and and so forth. But I think the main goal, as I mentioned last video, is that the Russians will try to move down on the Seversk Donetsk River, and then once they take Kupyansk and liquidate this Oskol bridgehead, then they'll move westward and try to meet up. And the main, probably big goal, kind of big picture, is to take something behind this red line, and this would take a huge part of the Kharkov Oblast. There's not a lot of big towns here per se. Kupyansk is obviously a big logistics node, but everything besides that is, Veliki Buruk is the biggest one, but I think it only had a pre-war population of like 10,000. It gives you a ton of land. That's a lot of things you can use for PR purposes. It can allow you to say, hey, we control, in terms of land area, 15 or 20% of Kharkov Oblast, and that could give you legitimacy to annex it. But besides that, it does the biggest thing it probably does is protect a huge chunk of Belgorod Oblast from Ukrainian attack, and allows you to continue pushing southwards towards Izium, which is probably one of the bigger long-term goals for the Russians, to try to encircle the Donbass from the north here. But anyway, yeah. And there's been no changes in the Sumy direction. So I hope you guys enjoyed this weekly Russian-Ukraine war update on what's happening on the ground. Be sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates. Like this video, comment your thoughts, share this video around, and hope you guys have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.